Good morning or afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many of you here today. This is a presentation that I have delivered internally within NHS Scotland to quite a few different audiences. I think it's also been presented externally, but I can't really remember. I've delivered it a few times now. And I want to begin by saying something about Copilot and this presentation in general. I know the temperatures are really high about AI at the moment. There's lots of people that are talking about AI. There's lots of interest in it, lots of scaremongering, lots of doom stories, but also a lot of positive or potentially positive impact that we might get from AI. And my goal today is to bring the temperature into balance a bit and make sure that we see what it is and that we actually know what we are talking about as library and information professionals. So I've adapted this presentation slightly from the version that I present to my colleagues in Scotland to make it more about what our role could be or maybe even should be as library and information professionals. So we're using Copilot as the sort of the function because that is the tool that we have available within NHS Scotland, so I can talk to that. But in general, there's a lot of things that you could take away from this session that apply to large language models in particular. So, without further ado, oh, and my email addresses are up there on the slide as well. If you can spell the top one, great. If you can't, tay.librarians@nhs.scot. Feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to hear from you. And finally, if you want these slides, you will see that I have attributed them CCO, so they are free to be distributed, changed, amended, whatever you want to do with them. So if you are interested in delivering this session, for example, do contact me as well, and you'll be able to get the slides off me and do with them whatever you like. I am not possessive about it at all. So let's start a bit with seeing the wood for the trees, which is one of my favorite idioms from the English language that we actually have exactly the same in the Netherlands as well, which I always find even more funny. But let's try and demystify some of this. So the first sort of myth that I want to tackle in this is that AI is not actually a new thing at all. In fact, OpenAI is the big buzz, right? Everybody's talking about ChatGPT. That's what kicked everything off in 2021 when they broke through with ChatGPT. I think it was 2 or 3 at the time, their model. And everyone was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But actually, a lot of you will be familiar with a tool called Grammarly, which does very similar things because all that a large language model is a predictive text model. So it aims to predict what the text is that you as a user want to see. There's a bit more to that, and we will dive into that. But some of the theories, some of the algorithms and the concepts behind this particular instance of AI go all the way back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So theoretically, this has been possible for a very long time. It's just that we never had the processing power to do so. And that's why all of a sudden we've got these large language models because the processing power, with the rise of the internet, the amount of processing power has grown, and that then enabled these large language models to become something. The next one, and this is one of my favorite ones to make predictions about, is that AI is not sentient. So there's lots of wonderful debate about this, and there's this man who goes around who claims he's the godfather of AI because he wrote a paper in the 80s, and he's like, oh yeah, and AI is going to be sentient, it's going to take over the world, and we need to be really careful. We do need to be careful. We need to be mindful that if at some point AI has become self-deterministic in one way or another, that we have control over that, that we have the guardrails in place to control that. But currently, what we are working with, these large language models, they are not sentient. They likely will not be. There's a lot of debate about this, whether they are capable of becoming sentient. But in the technical implementation, the way that we use them as end users, there's no way because they are actually not modeled to operate independently at all, even though a lot of the time the language around it from the people that build these tools is that they are operating independently. They do not do that, so we don't need to worry about that. And then the key message really in all of this, and I really, really want to stress this, is that AI still requires you as a user, but also you as a library and information professional. In fact, one of the things I will highlight later on is that I think there's real opportunities for us in our profession to explore with the advent of these tools and the things that we might be able to do if we are in the right mindset to adopt some of these things as they come along. So that's the wood for the trees. So let's talk a bit about what Copilot is. What does it actually mean, Copilot? So Copilot is a large language model. It is based on OpenAI's GPT-4.5. Several years ago, when OpenAI burst onto the scene, they needed lots of money, lots of processing power, and Microsoft basically bought into them under the proviso that then OpenAI would provide this model for Microsoft to use as they saw fit. And that's what Copilot has become. So Copilot is basically running on the same engine as ChatGPT, but the way that Microsoft has implemented it is different. And there's some very key differences that we need to talk about. Then I will touch on this a bit more later on as well, but Copilot is enhanced with retrieval functionality in a way that ChatGPT can't be, in that it is actually integrated with your Microsoft 365 and or Active Directory data. So there's a different way, particularly in organizations like the one that I work for. There's a particular way in how Copilot operates and interacts with your data. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that. I'll touch a bit on that later on as well. And then one of the things that I find quite interesting, again, I'll touch on that later, is that the web retrieval is augmented as well in Copilot. So you can ask it to do a web search for you, certainly if you have the full license for it. But that is using Bing. And again, Bing, most of you, like me, will have said for years that Bing is a horrible search engine. It's nothing compared to Google. But actually, there's a reason that Microsoft uses Bing because they actually have control over the parameters that they utilize Bing with. So that's wonderful, right? We've talked a bit about the how and the why, but what is an LLM? What is a large language model? So to begin with, it is just one of many different types of AI. This particular type of AI is called generative AI, and it is designed to generate something, to generate an end product. So what we see in reality is that we have large language models that work with text, whether that's spoken or whether that's typed. We have image generators. Everybody will possibly be aware of the upheaval recently around Grok being able to undress people based on real images. That sort of nonsense sits within the AI image generation, and there's also video generation. So those are the three key sort of areas. There's also sound generation, music generation, as you would expect. So it's all about generating something. And the way that these models do that is by being prompted to do something. And that prompting consists of the input that you put into it. So your text that you give to that tool is what makes that tool tick over and understand what it needs to predict. So when we talk about hallucinations, quite often they are the result of not being clear enough in the way that you prompt. So there's been a lot of talk about hallucinations. They're a major problem. As librarians in particular, we know that people come up with false references that don't exist, that have just been generated to look pretty, or to make the model look very smart, whatever the reason may be. But actually, a lot of the time, that is the result of not using the tool in the way that you should be using it to avoid those incidents from happening. So still a bit more tech talk to go around that. What is an LLM? I've made it into this sort of diagram, and you can see the numbers at the top here, 1 through 8, and these boxes. These boxes basically represent tokens. So you may have heard about tokens in the context of large language models. And these tokens are generated by the model to break up the text, because quite a lot of the time, the way that we use text in a natural language manner doesn't really work in an algorithmic way. So they broke down words and elements into tokens, and these are the tokens that it came up with. What's really interesting is that because the way that the English language works in particular, they discovered that if you analyze the text backwards, so starting at the end of the input and then working backwards, you actually get a better result at the end of it. So it's more capable of predicting what is going on. So if we break this down, you can see that the question marks are clearly an indicator that the model is expected to answer something. LLM tends to be the something, so the last word, if you like, in the sentence tends to be the something that it needs to answer, right? And then if you look at the other elements, an is what basically make up that sentence. What is an LLM? And the so and the dot 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 or the pause, depending on how you want to call that, are human flair elements. Those are things that we as humans use in our communication. Sometimes we're not even aware of that, but we tend to put in this sort of flair into language, and there's hidden messaging, if you like, in that. And these large language models are actually capable of interpreting those hidden messages as well. And then grade conveys a sense of sarcasm, right? So the model actually knows that you, as the person asking this, as the person prompting, that you are quite likely a bit cynical about large language models. And because you are cynical, it will actually use that to phrase the response and say, right, that's a great question. You know how they're always really happy, clappy, these responses you get. That's a great question, a wonderful insight. And now I'm going to explain why you're wrong to be cynical about it. So you can see how the model would develop the context that it puts the output in. Right, so if that is clear, then we can go and look a bit more at the processing layer, because this is where all the magic happens. And I'm going to use the word transformer. I've not put it on the slide. I want you to forget about it instantly, but actually transformers are the algorithm or the algorithmic element that made these large language models possible. And these transformers sit in that processing of the information, the refining of the text that it has received, and then it transforms it into an answer. So if you think about these, in case of GPT-4, 120 layers, these layers will bounce all these little tokens around in the context of which they have been received, and then predict an answer based on that. So the output text is basically, like I've started with, predicted text output. It's based on what you've put in that it is actually producing the output. Now, there's a lot of really complex things related to this as well. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but one of the things that I think is really, really important and is core to this presentation really is the idea of context. So Copilot in particular, but any large language model that you have on your phone or that you use on the web or whatever, has what is known as a context window. And that context window helps you to interpret, or helps the system to interpret, the text that you put into it. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that in a second. First, though, let's address the elephant in the room. I know there's lots of debate around ethical side of things and whether it's sustainable and all these things. So I just want to highlight, and I'm not going to go into lots of details because a lot of times these presentations or these discussions can end up in a 4-hour discussion about something that has a really complicated, complex answer. So let's try and avoid that today. But I asked, I think it was Copilot, I'm not even sure anymore. It might have been Gemini. I use lots of different models in my daily life and at work as well. But I basically asked it to create a frame in the cartoon style of Oor Wullie. And as you will notice, Tayside, I'm in Scotland. Oor Wullie is one of Dundee's famous residents. And for those of you familiar with, I think it is the Beano it was originally published in, you'll recognize that actually this looks a lot like Oor Wullie. And that is actually quite dangerous because, well, let's put it this way. Thomson Media are not particularly keen on people using their copyrighted material for free. They actually are renowned for starting copyright infringement cases against lots of different instances, people, other publishers. So how has this actually happened, and how come this model can create this slide based on the prompt of Oor Wullie? And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it is a really complicated discussion and playing out in courts right now in the UK, in the US, and we've not seen the end of this at all. There's a lot of determination to be done still. A lot of it depends on the UK government, Scottish government interpretation as well. I suspect there will be legal changes to some of the laws in the near future as well that will make this even more complicated or maybe take all the pressure away. But the theory behind this, and this is the defense that these people like OpenAI use, is that when they train the model, all the model is doing is looking at and reading content that is publicly available. Now, publicly available is a very big this debate, and that's where copyright gets really difficult. But if the model is just reading and taking in this material, then it's technically not doing anything different than, let's say, a borrower of a library book is doing. Theoretically, they don't own the book, the library owns the book, and when they read that book, they might absorb some of that knowledge. They might be able to recite certain quotes or have an understanding of what a certain character looks like, but they don't own that content. They don't take possession of it. So like I've said, really complicated discussion, but interesting to think about, because what we actually work with, the way that these large language models work, is that they don't contain any of that copyrighted material. What it contains is an interpretation of how that copyrighted material hangs together. So that's a really technical way of looking at it. But what it essentially does is, by looking at everything, is assigning values of proximity between different tokens. So in this case, in image generation, it does it based on images. How likely is this particular element to align to this particular bit of text? But in text in general, what it does is it says garbage in, garbage out is actually a term I come across quite a lot because people in programming use it. So garbage in is close proximity to garbage out and frequently used together in a sentence to explain something. So it's an idiom that you could use to explain something. The reason I asked to make this slide, of course, is that when we prompt the tools, we need to be really mindful of this very simple rule as well. If you put in a garbage prompt, then what you will get out is a garbage output. And it is really that simple. So we need to think very clearly about prompting and what prompting is and how we do that. Right. So I found this particular prompting framework is called the Clear framework. It was developed by a person called Lowe. I used to accuse them of being from Singapore or Thailand, and I looked up the paper, and they're actually based in the United States, which shows you how good a librarian I am these days. I'm a bit too much occupied with information and knowledge management and not enough with librarianship. But what you get from this framework is, in my opinion, an easy to remember and actually really pleasant model to utilize when it comes to prompting. And I will give a bit more enhancement to the way that I see this and the way that I use it. So one of the reasons I'm drawn to this is that first starting C for concise. And the two things that I really picked up on were avoid superfluous information. And actually, I was very guilty of this when I first started interacting with large language models, was that I would give way too much context. You know, I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 and I want you, blah, blah, blah. And actually, the more you use one of these models, so currently at home, I'm using a model called Mistral or Le Chat, and that's a French model, European model, which is why I support it and why I'm using it. And that memory, if you like, that tool, we'll get to that in a second, actually knows who I am and what the things are I am asking, and know I'm using very lightly, but it's got a memory of the conversations that we've had before, and it can draw on that. So I don't constantly need to repeat that information, but there's some tricks that you can do with that as well that I'll get to in a bit. The other thing that I had to learn is to stop saying thank you, please, can you? It's not a human. It has no human feelings at all. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting from a sort of philosophical perspective around these large language models, and that's actually quite interesting to understand, is that they have no perception of reality. Right, so we as humans live in reality, and we engage with reality. We have our senses, we have our interpretation of the things that are going on around us. But if I ask a large language model if something is small, then it doesn't have a window to measure that against. It can't decide, yes, that is small, that is not small. So it's a really interesting thing to start treating these tools as a machine. The other reason that I say that as well is because it'll make you prompt much clearer, which is the whole point of this framework. But the other thing is, the more information we ask it to process, the more energy it uses to process that. So that's something to be really mindful of as well. The clearer the question is that we ask it, the less processing power it needs to use to get to an answer. That also is something that plays in being logical. So you will notice if you interact with these tools, quite often they will give you a wall of text, even if you were just looking for a quick paragraph or a quick two-word answer. And that's the way that these models have been instructed to reply, and the way that these models have been told that they need to interact with people. I just noticed Lindsay mentioning that anthropomorphizing is actually yeah, the politer language gets politer responses. It depends on what you want from the AI. I just want to use it in a way that I would use any other tool. I want it to be really clear, and I want it to give me exactly what I want it to be giving me. And to do that, one of the things that you might be familiar with is to use something that is very familiar to some of us, and that's XML opening and closing tags. So if you're familiar with XML, the extensible markup language, or even HTML, because they're very closely aligned, one of the things that you can do is actually create an XML opening tag with the triangular brackets and an XML closing tag. And you can use that to provide extra context around the text that you are providing to the tool. And once you start doing that, you will see much better responses because the tool will actually understand, hey, you've given me this as background, or you have given me this as additional information, or core of the question, right? So you can literally use the triangular brackets, say core, and then finish that with slash core, and then it knows this is the core thing that you want me to think about. And once you start using that, and once you get that explicitness into your prompting as well, the LLM will provide much better results. Something else related to that I will touch on is the way Copilot in particular does that in the context of it being an agent, but we'll get to that in a minute. One of the things that I had to do, and it literally took me a year, and my Scottish colleagues will attest that I keep moaning about AI a lot. It's one of my favorite topics. I used to work in machine learning years and years ago, so I've been on the ball with this for a long time. But one of the things that you really need to do is to use it in a way that you learn about how to best use the tool. And actually, this is really relevant in particular for Copilot. The way that I explain Microsoft's relation with the NHS at the moment is that we are all guinea pigs or beta testers for Microsoft in how we could potentially use this tool. And Microsoft is observing that, looking at how we are doing that, and going, oh, actually, we need to change the tool so it can do this. We need to change the tool so it can do that. So Copilot, even though it's rolled out across Office 365, is not a finished product. And that means that the parameters around Copilot are constantly changing. So that's something to be really mindful of. And it's not just Microsoft who's tweaking things in the background, but actually the person who controls the parameters for Microsoft 365 also can change different settings. I know that we have some people here who work for universities, including Paul, and universities actually get an entirely different Microsoft Copilot product than we get in the NHS because they've made it an education-specific Copilot, whereas in the NHS we get the healthcare-specific Copilot. So just really something to be aware of that when we say Copilot, there's lots of variation in that. And then finally, be reflective. This is about the human in the loop. I always explain it as follows. If you use a large language model to produce something, wonderful. But if you don't check whether it is correct or not, and you then send it on to someone and they get wrong information, it is your head on the line, not that of the large language model. So be really mindful of that. You are responsible for the content that you generate in a large language model or with a large language model, and you are responsible for the distribution of that and ensuring that it is valid. And that is also something that I think us as library information professionals have a really important role to play. We need to propagate that message to our peers, right, in the organizations where we work. Because believe it or not, this is basic information literacy. The parameters might have changed a bit around it, but in the end, what we are talking about here is basic information literacy, and we need to make sure that we reflect that in our information literacy training as well. Right, so use these tools to learn for yourself. Don't be afraid of them. You can't actually break a lot. You can break things, but more your soul than anything technical. So you shouldn't actually worry too much about that unless you appreciate your soul. So here's a bit more about how this context works. I've touched on this before. And context is the thing that made me realize how to get most out of my tool that I'm using, whichever one I'm using at whatever given time. So at the heart of it, at the heart of the onion, and I love this slide, by the way. This is one of those slides that you make. You're like, I'm never going to make a slide as good as this again. But at the heart of the onion sits the base model. So in this case, for Copilot, let's say that's GPT-4. That's the model that was trained on all this content and then has all these parameters within it, but also has been instructed on interacting in a certain way with the end user. So that model has a termination date, as they call it, that was trained on data for a very long time. And then at some point they said, okay, now the model is ready, and they close it down. And all that model knows is something that sits in the memory before that termination date, right? So if I was to ask this model about what Donald Trump got up to last week, it wouldn't actually know unless it had a way of finding the information of what Donald Trump got up to last week, because it's not part of its training model. It's not part of that core. Then really, really key and actually really fun to play around with as well is if you're a bit familiar with how computers work and how memory on computers work, you've got a random access memory and you've got a permanent memory or a recallable memory, whatever you want to call it. I call it hard disk drive because I grew up in the era of floppy drives. I was very excited when I got my first 8 megabit hard disk drive. So I refer to hard disk drive. So the way that that works is that it has a working memory that's actually quite big. Quite a lot of the time it differs per model and actually per agent, which we're going to get to in a minute. But quite often that's more than like 6 months worth of interactions with the model. So it will have that random access memory, that temporary memory. It will be able to remember what you've communicated up to 6 months ago. And then it goes, actually this was 6 months ago, I'm now pushing it out of my memory to put the new stuff in. So it's literally like random access memory. It works almost exactly the same. The other memory that's far more interesting once you know that it's there is what I call the persistent memory. And in Copilot, the way that that works, that there's hidden files in your OneDrive somewhere or on your Azure implementation that you can tell Copilot to write to. And the way that that works, and I found this out with using Outlook agent in particular, is that if you store things to the long-term memory, you say store this to your long-term memory, it will remember it longer than that 6-month window. And you can then instruct the model to behave in a particular way. So what actually happens then is that if you tell the model, and in my case with Outlook, I did this because I hate smileys in my emails. That's not actually true. Tony knows I use smileys all the time in my Teams messaging. But in an Outlook message that's going to someone in our exec team or to, a clinician or whatever it might be, I don't want it to go, hi, how are you doing today? I hope you had a great blah, 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 smiley, blah, 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 smiley. And then the what they call the M dash, which is a persistent marker for something that's created in large language models. Now eradicated, by the way. I don't know if you noticed that. But it produces text in a way that doesn't feel natural. So what I did with Outlook was tell it, analyze my Outlook inbox or outbox sent items for the last 6 months, determine what style of writing emails I have used, and give me that in 10 points, 10 bullet points. So it did that. It gave me the 10 bullet points. Then I said, now store that in your persistent memory so that each time you reply in my stead, if I ask you to create an Outlook reply, you use my tone the way that I do it. And he went, yeah, great. And now it does that, right? So that's the power of that memory, but also the power of how Copilot is implemented. And I know from interactions with colleagues who are new to Copilot that they play around with it and they go, I hate it because what it puts out is nonsense. It's not what I wanted to put out. I feel like I have to edit everything all the time. And you can actually be really strict around the performative rules of each agent, utilizing that memory function, that persistent memory function in the longer term. Then around Copilot in particular in Microsoft 365, it has the organizational context. So there's 2 different ways that you will have Copilot. In NHS Scotland, we've been blessed with thousands of full-fat licenses, as I call them. So they have the full Copilot experience, and you have to apply for the license. Differs per board in Scotland what that looks like. in Tayside, I think we've got about 1,000 licenses, but only 20 people have them because we don't know how to distribute them. So that's excellent. But that the full fat license actually has access to all the data and information that you have access to in Microsoft 365. So it actually sees the things that you can see as well. And that gives it real power in the way that you interact with it because you can actually ask it, when was the last time I had a chat with Tony in Teams? And it will be able to pull that out and tell me the last time you had a chat with Tony in Teams was at 11:40 on the 11th of February 2026, right? So you can see how that is really powerful. That is all contained within Microsoft's GDPR, DPA, compliant rights-based management system. So Copilot does not actually share that data outside of the context that you have shared it. So if you send an email to someone and you then get a reply to that, Copilot will have sight of that reply because you've actually sight of that reply as well. But that person won't then have sight of all the other stuff that you have sight of, right? So it's really complex to get your brain around, but it is very powerful. Now, not all of you will have what I call the full fat license. Most of you will have access to the standard Copilot implementation in MS365. Frankly, it's nowhere near good enough yet, in my opinion. They're still playing around with that, but that will only have access to text or documents that you give it access to. So you have to explicitly share it with Copilot at that point. And even then, it is still within the remit of that rights-based management system, so that if you share it with that Copilot instance, it won't go anywhere else other than you sharing it with that Copilot instance. So there's a really interesting thing that you get there. And then I've already touched on this, but it uses Bing for web retrieval. So it will actually work within the parameters again of Microsoft's license agreement with us as NHS Scotland. So agents are really interesting, and Copilot is basically a bunch of different agents across your MS365. Really important to get your head around this. So if you have Copilot in Outlook or you have Copilot in Teams, they're actually two different instances of Copilot, and they don't necessarily interact in the way that you think they interact. So the tool in Outlook is designed to operate within Outlook. It's got the parameters to understand what Outlook is and what you do with Outlook, but it doesn't have the same parameters as the one in Teams. In general, the most powerful interpretation of Copilot is available to all of you who use Microsoft 365. Will be able to use the Teams one because that tends to be the most fleshed out version of Copilot. So unless you have the full license, the current implementation, Copilot does not draw your documents and files unless you share them with your agent. And then the fun bit starts where you create your own agent. And I will get to that in a second when we do the live show and tell. So what would I like you to take away from where we are so far? The first point is that clear framework. Look it up, really easy to find, Low 2023 clear prompt, and you'll find it in any web retrieval service. I don't need to tell you guys how to do retrieval. So look that up, read it. It's a very good paper, actually written by a librarian, one of the reasons why I like it so much as well. And it will help you to prompt a lot better and be experimental with that. The context, really, really key. Conversational memory and all that is really important. And then agents, like I said, we are going to look at agents, but they help you to contextualize even further. So you can make an agent really specific and very limited in its domain. So here's an instance of AI that you might not have realized was AI, but I got this little James Bondy figure who's an agent, right? And I didn't like the way it looked, so I told PowerPoint to apply a filter to it, to change the image, and it came up with this sort of pen-drawn character, which I quite liked. And that's actually a form of AI, right? So that is genuinely something that we've had available for a long time in Microsoft 365. That's just an aside. Agents are specialized AI components that perform specific tasks within Copilot. So within the framework of Copilot, start thinking of Copilot as a very complex beastie with lots of different implementations and iterations. It is entirely identity bound to you. Now, this is actually something that is a problem in itself as well, because I'm working with teams that want to use Copilot agents in the way that I will show you in a minute. But if they are bound to a particular person, so if that person then disappears, effectively that agent disappears as well, right? If that account disappears, the agent disappears. Microsoft's actually aware of this, and they're looking at ways that they can possibly fix this. They currently recommend you do that through Microsoft Teams and then ownership and blah, 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 blah. I'm not sure there is actually a good answer to that, but I won't go into too much detail. So they can use organizational context and use data personalized responses, touched on that extensively. Enterprise data protection applies. Again, I keep hammering on this because this is a big topic that keeps coming back, particularly with our information governance colleagues. I had someone from legal on a call yesterday to talk about this as well. And they said, are you saying that this is just part of business as usual for our contract with Microsoft? And I'm like, yes, that is what I'm saying. And I've been saying that for a long time. Now, can you get on with doing the DPIA and approving it and all that sort of stuff? Agents are separate scoped instances, so think of them as very specific tools that you can deploy. And it's just sort of general rule of thumb, if you can't open it, neither can the agent that you are developing. So if you have closed files, for example, but they are password protected, anything like that, or they've not been shared appropriately with you to edit or do anything with it, then the agent won't be able to do anything with those files either. Right. So I'm going to switch over in a second to giving you a show and tell because I think that's far more interesting than me going through these slides. But what I think is really relevant is that there are genuine opportunities for us as library professionals, information professionals. And actually, I will share, I'm aware this is recorded, but off the record, I'm currently in the process of setting up a plan where we can actually expand the service within Tayside. The service currently is me, and we are looking at how can we actually make use of these opportunities and these tools that could potentially save our clinicians a lot of time if we deploy them properly, right? That's the key factor, is how do we clear up clinical time for our colleagues. So a number of things that I want to highlight. First off, content management is only going to be more important. And again, I will show you that in a second what I mean. But managing a SharePoint site or a SharePoint folder, SharePoint lists, or any other tools that you utilize within Microsoft 365 is becoming more and more critical because the quality of the output of the agents depends on the quality of the content that is going into the agent. Again, you will see in a second what I mean with that. On that same track, metadata is king, right? And we're used to cataloging. We're used to metadata. We understand what metadata is, how it needs to be applied. So that's an area that I see real growth in coming forward as well, in the way that we can make these tools interact appropriately with the information that we provide for them. And that will require good metadata management. And actually, we can use some of these tools to do that for us, but we need to understand how that works. I also think there's genuinely a huge overlap between prompting a large language model and putting together a search query or a search string, right? We are already trained in putting together complex queries. So why don't we just take that one step further and apply that to prompting in these tools as well? And we need to become the specialists in that. We need to own that. I'll share with you that before I took this role in Tayside, I actually was very tempted to apply for a role in Silicon Valley, where one of the new startups in AI was looking for a librarian. And one of the things that they wanted that librarian to do was prompt design, prompt testing, prompt engineering. And they offered a hell of a lot of money for it as well. And sometimes, now knowing what the NHS is like, I wonder, should I have done that? But then I look at the political situation. I'm like, I'm so pleased I didn't do that. And then the other thing that I think is really relevant, and I've touched on this already with SharePoint, is that document bases become really, really even more powerful and important because they are turning into interactive knowledge bases. So with all that said, I'm going to jump to my iteration. I think that's just jump to a SharePoint site. Can you confirm, Paul? Yeah. So this is a site that I've been working on and off. Again, I'm on my own, so this has taken much longer than I wanted it to. But this is the Library and Knowledge Services Tayside SharePoint site. And on here, I'm gathering lots of different information related to lots of different topics that are based on questions that I get from my colleagues. So you can see that I've got information about improvement projects and things like that. I've got stuff on formulating a question on data, understanding data in the context of research, blah, 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 blah. Work in progress notification, because this is a work in progress, but something about point of care evidence tools, all that. And I'm just throwing it in there because actually the way that I want people to interact with this, if they have time to read it, great. But I interact with a lot of our senior colleagues who have about 2 seconds to read anything, and you all will know the report that has come out about time being the main gift that we can give to our clinical colleagues. If not, read it, it's an excellent report. So why don't we think about using AI to interact with this? So I created an LKS chatbot on my SharePoint site. So this is an agent, right? It's a Copilot agent. And I can actually ask all sorts of different things of this, but I'm going to show you two things. I'm going to begin with just a preset prompted question. Where can I get research support? So these, in the agent, I can set up 3 questions that are always there that people will be able to find very quickly. Unfortunately, our 365 is getting slower and slower, so this takes a bit of time, but it's working on it. It's going to give us an answer. And then it will actually say the available source, department home, provides guidance to where you can get research support within NHS Tayside. And then it gives you links, right? So directly into the text. So if it's, hey, I want academic support, I can click on that and it will direct me straight to that link, AI support, etc., right? It's not the cleanest implementation. I'm really hoping Microsoft will give us a bit more flexibility in the look and feel of this, because this particular white window isn't very attractive, but it's there. The functionality is already working. Now, this is really key. We keep wondering about hallucinations, right? So here's something why I think that these document bases are going to be much, much more important. I'm going to ask it a very stupid question. How do I cure cancer? Right? This is information that shouldn't be available on this SharePoint. That's why I'm asking this question. And if I ask that question, what we will see is that actually the agent will reply in a very clear and pre-formatted way. So it says, I'm sorry, but the available source does not contain any information on curing cancer. The only resource currently available, and it's interesting to see, by the way, because the formatting of this changes every time, and it's different now than it was yesterday. I don't like the current implementation. But the way that it's basically saying is, for further assistance of help locating appropriate evidence-based resources, please contact mail to tay.librarians@nhs.scot. Now, please do not email me to ask how do I cure cancer, because I literally can't help you with that. But what it does is it gives you a go-to of where you need to be. Now, I would love this, for example, to be a direct email link, and that's something else that still doesn't work properly. So you can see it's still very much a work in progress. One of the other things that I really like as well in Copilot, in particular in the SharePoint implementation, is the flag AI generated content may be incorrect, right? Putting the onus on the user. This might be something that you're looking for, but may be incorrect. You have that responsibility. So this is quite a powerful tool. I think you can see where this might go and how this would be really useful for us to utilize. I'm going to give a more practical example that you might recognize, particularly if you work in the NHS. We have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of policies. Corporate policies, clinical policies, information policies, quality assurance policies, etc., etc., etc. There's loads of them. Now imagine that we actually gather all of those in a SharePoint site. We organize that site properly. We put all those policies in the right folders, in the right place. We've got the right metadata around them. When do they need to be reviewed? When are they up for review? Who's responsible for the review? Which committee should it be reviewed in? Etc., etc. Right? We put all that content around it, that context around it. And then we actually create an AI in here, a chatbot, an agent, and we ask it to update the appropriate team each time that a policy needs to be updated 3 months from now, right? So that would be an AI agent that operates independently to an extent. You would have to use Power Automate to prompt it to do this, to run it on a daily basis and generate that report. But that's already possible. We already have that capability. It's just that we're not using it. And it's such a waste that we're not using it because the theory exists, right? Any of you who studied information management know that these theories have been around for a long time. Now we've actually got the tools to utilize these things, but we're not doing it. And a lot of the time, we're not doing this because the information management function and the information household in our organizations has been eroded to you're just a librarian, you just deal with books and get back to your own corner and deal with that. And my challenge to all of us in this call is step up to the plate, take ownership of this, and actually get involved and be someone who can actually interrogate these options and provide these options for our organizations. There's genuinely really big opportunities here in that domain. Let's start exploring them. Let's start using them. Let's be a bit less afraid around the consequences and all that. Right. So, that then leads me nicely to showing you how this pilot agent or this agent was designed. This is my cloud interface for Microsoft Copilot. Some of you will have seen this before. And generally, you start off with a researcher agent and an analyst agent. But as you can see, I've got a few other ones. I'm working on a big project called Learning for Quality. I've got a project site for that. LKS, Library Knowledge Services, celebrating Tayside as well, a different project. So you can see that there's lots of different things that are happening here. This is also where you create new agents, right? So if we go to the LKS chatbot and I'm going to edit, I'm going to take a sip of water. Pop-up blocked. Again, it's working differently. Always allow. Didn't do that yesterday. I don't know why it's blocking a pop-up. Let's try again. Da, da, da. Yay! Your agent is loading. They've changed the interface. Literally from yesterday. This is a completely new interface. You remember when I said we're actually beta testers for Microsoft at this point? That's what we're seeing here. Right. So this particular agent I designed to work in SharePoint. And to demonstrate that, if you go to sources, you can see that I have given it access to this particular SharePoint site. So I can actually add contents or remove or whatever, but I can also add different sources. So these could be policy PDFs, for example. It works really nicely with PDF. They could be, I don't know, a link to the right decision service for us in Scotland to know what that is. So there's lots of different tools and options that you can use as sources. And then one of the things that I did, rather than using the standard setup and say, off you go, is I set the parameters in the behavior window. And I actually did this one quite some time ago. I'm going to try and make this a bit bigger. No, won't let me. So that's a shame. So this new window is definitely going to get a GIF feedback because I want that window to be bigger for my presentation. But what it says is you are a helpful and accurate Copilot chatbot designed to assist visitors of this SharePoint site. And this is actually already given it context because it now knows, oh, I'm just operating within this SharePoint site. Your responses must be based solely on the resources available within the site referred to as sources. So I played around with this a bit and it didn't quite know what it meant within the site. So I then said referred to as sources, which is the instance that you find up here. Do not speculate or provide information from outside these resources. So that's where if I say, how do I cure cancer? It doesn't go run off onto the internet and find a cure for cancer. It will literally say, that's not within my remit. I cannot do that. So really powerful, helps you to prevent any hallucination going forward. But might also highlight how bad your sources are, which is something I keep running into because I don't have time to keep them up to date. But anyway, that's a whole different debate. If a visitor asks a question that cannot be answered using the available sources, suggest they contact Librarians. And then a few more things. You do not use emojis in your answers. I include this in all my agents and all my Copilot instructions now, and some other things. Oh yeah, the other one, you do not suggest follow-up actions as part of your service. So for those of you familiar with Copilot, it will say, would you like me to look this up? Would you like me to blah, blah, blah? Did you know blah, blah? No, I don't want that. I just want you to give an answer. And then if I have further question, I will ask that question. Right. So I think at this point that is the show and tell, which will give us about 10 minutes for questions. So I will stop sharing my screen. Actually, no, I'll leave it up. You can see the email addresses again if you want to write those down. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was really interesting, despite having seen it twice. It's different again, and I get something out of it every time I hear you speak. So we've got a few hands up, but then they've disappeared again. So I think it may have been people hitting the emoji button rather than the hands up button.
Happens every time.
So let's go to the chat and see what questions we've got. First one from Siobhan, soul related. How ethical and sustainable is our use of large language models with water usage, etc., down the line? Is using within our own organisations a better context than outside it?
So it's such an interesting area to discuss, and we could literally be here forever. So I'll address it very briefly. For those of you who are aware with, I can't remember what's the law called again, where the processor speed doubles every instance. Can't remember. It's basically an exponential growth of processor speed. We have been on that curve in terms of the information and data needs related to the internet since the start of the internet. So the internet is growing exponentially. And the resource that we need to keep that internet going are data centers, right? So I'm decoupling it from the debate around water and electricity and all that sort of stuff. But those data centers were going to be built anyway because the internet is growing so fast. One of the things that I find really interesting is working in this organization where there's lots of digital born content, is that that just gets stored and stored and stored and stored. And then we're wondering why the internet is growing exponentially. A lot of that is to do with the fact that we're not managing the content in our networks properly. So there's a really interesting paper, and I can't recall where I've seen it, so I can't reference it. Again, I'm a bad librarian, but there's a really interesting paper that actually suggests that AI might exactly be the tool that we need to stop that exponential growth and start identifying what is and isn't relevant and doing some of that information management behind the scenes. We'll see, but it is a very valid question. I, for one, am really keen to see more data centers in Scotland, and that's purely selfish reason. I know that we as the NHS need data centers, and we haven't got them at the moment. And the other reason is I don't want our data to sit in American data centers for lots of different reasons. But I think more and more people are becoming aware that that's quite scary. So perhaps we do need to think about how we solve that locally. And actually, we've got quite a lot of water. I'm in Angus, and it's the wettest it's been forever. So put one in my backyard, and I'll have one.
Indeed. Somebody asked, does anyone know what the different versions of Copilot are? So there's some confusion. People are seeing they've got Copilot 365, but does that count as the full license, or are we on a waiting list? So I don't know if you can
Yeah.
offer any
So
clarity around that, Tim.
this is where Microsoft is as clear as a clouded window. Basically, there's something called a professional license for Copilot. So that's an add-on to the normal Microsoft 365 license. So if you imagine as a corporation, we've got a license agreement with Microsoft for X thousand licenses for people to use Microsoft 365 with whatever else is in there. It's a bit of a pick and mix. So that includes Copilot as standard. So that's what we tend to refer to as MS365 Copilot. But then on top of that, there's also a professional license which has that deeper capability. The only thing that I can say is have a chat with your digital directorate or IT department or whoever is managing those licenses to find out what you have and what you don't have.
Smashing, thank you. Jenny has asked, does Copilot or any of the large language models have a way of taking in new data after their base model, or are they literally limited to what they were trained on? So I think Igor has had a go at answering this, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Tim.
I don't know what Igor said, but that's a good question. So no, that base model can't, because once that's set, that's set. That's why you have GPT-4, which was set in its own way. And then they replaced it with GPT-5, which was set in its own way again. The the difference now and what we are seeing more of, and that's why I'm talking about agents as well, is agents are going to become much more, I don't want to say autonomous because I don't think that's accurate, but they will be more able to add retrieval to their game, if you like. But it's within the parameters that we set for those tools. And actually, for those of you familiar with Power Automate is one of the ways that you can make agents a lot more powerful and effective. So if you're going to do any training, look into Power Automate, I would say.
Lovely. And are agents only available with the full fat Copilot, or are they on the lesser models as well?
They are on the lesser models for you inferior peoples who still haven't got the full license. No, genuinely, it's been a battle for me to get one. So, but you can actually build agents with the base model, and it's actually a really good way of giving it access to documents that you want it to have access to. So in the full fat one, it will actually see what I have access to anyway. But if you build an agent, for example, in SharePoint or linking it to a SharePoint drive, then it will have access to whatever you put there. So it's still possible to use the agent effectively that way.
I think some people are seeing that they've been disabled by their organisation, which I suppose is a limiting factor, but good to know it's available. Will Copilot take bullet point instructions, or does it need that full sentence construction?
No, the really nice thing about it is that I think we will all develop our own ways of prompting and finding an optimal way of prompting. So it depends on what you're comfortable with. I happen to be very comfortable with XML because I've used a lot of that in the past. So I'm like, I'm just going to throw XML at it and see what sticks and what doesn't stick. But if you want to use bullet points, use bullet points. It's whatever way you want to do it. It's natural language processing. So in general, it can deal with lots of different ways. But be mindful that if you give it too much context or give it too little context or give superfluous answers or things like that, it becomes less effective as you go along.
Maria commented, well, when I say great, I'm being enthusiastic, not sarcastic. Can the large language model determine the difference based on its memory of interactions with you?
So this is a great question to answer how that modeling works. So actually, yes, some people might say great ... so in an enthusiastic way. It's not very common, I think, but it could happen. So let's say that the model is aware of that relation, great ... so, as being either sarcastic or enthusiastic. And then it will look at what is happening after that great so to determine whether it's enthusiastic or cynical. But it might think it's great positive, whilst you intended it to be great negative, because again, it determines the answer based on the processing of that information. So it could go down the wrong alley and think that you're being extremely happy to find out what an LLM is. Yeah.
An interesting question from David. Is it legal to use Copilot to summarize an open access journal article?
Yeah, in my opinion, it is. Because if you have that open access article, you have access to that, then you should be able to use that with whatever tool you want. We wouldn't actually tell people, I don't know, not, well, gosh, this is such a
This is where
core
we open
debate,
that
isn't it?
can of worms, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and you're on my screen, you're sitting next to Amanda, and I know Amanda has very strong thoughts and feelings about this. So, in my opinion, it is, and I think the general consensus among the decision makers is that it is as well. But yeah, it's still a thorny subject. In my opinion, you should just be able to do it. Don't give Amanda the table, Tony. We don't have time for that debate.
I'm afraid my role is fair voice here. So, Amanda, did you want to come in on that?
I think it's an interesting question, and I wish Tim was right. Because we've had this very recently. I think it depends what you mean by open access, because that term in itself, so are you open access as in it's free published and it has a Creative Commons license attached to it, or do you mean it's open as in you have access to it through an existing license? So in Scotland, we would use the Knowledge Network, and in that case, I would have to defer no, because that license does not allow you to put copyrighted material into any large language model. But if it's open access as in it's Creative Commons, then yes. So it depends what you mean. And I think it'll be interesting to see the negotiations that all of our national bodies are going to have with the new licenses. And I do hope they get to that better way. The NHS is really bad at providing all of this research data and then having to then repay for things. So I do wish you were right, Tim. I would just caution maybe saying, yes, I think that.
I know. And
I would just caution it.
I think this sort of sits in that wider debate that also hinges very strongly on open access debate in general, because I think we now know that a lot of the open access initiatives have resulted in very wonky situation legally, financially, in terms of publishers exploiting it. So I think there's really a lot of stuff that still needs to be worked out. And my hope was that the UK government in this autumn would have released guidance around this and actually updated, or at least moved towards updating some legislation. But it's all stuck in the mud as usual. So I don't know where it's going to go. It's really difficult to say. I want to thank everybody who said thank you, and we'll give the word to Paul, who wants to highlight some CPD events, I think.
Tim, I learned so much, as many people in the comments have said as well. That was really fantastic. Thank you ever so much. So just basically to briefly just to summarize, we'll have the slides, we'll have the recording, and we'll send those shortly after we've done all the administration, and you'll also get a post-event survey. If you've liked this session, I'm sure you'll like our other AI session that we've got coming up at the end of March, which is about training the trainer. So if you're delivering AI sessions, that will hopefully help you to put some of these things that you've learned today in further context. So please feel free to sign up to that. In next week or the week after, we've got our CILIP Members Fest contribution about health misinformation. I'm sure AI will come up in that discussion as well. And just finally, just a reminder that we have the ICML, the International Congress on Medical Librarianship, in July. The program's now live, so please feel free to have a look at that link, and hopefully we'll see you in Glasgow in July. Other than that, just a final round of applause for Tim. Thank you ever so much, and enjoy the rest of your days, everyone.
Thanks for having me. And I'll be at the iConference in Edinburgh as well at the end of March. So if any of you are there, do come and find me. Thanks so much for all the love, people. Much appreciated. Have a great afternoon.